In the summer of 2013, a team of forensic anthropologists knelt in the sandy soil of the Florida Panhandle with picks, trowels, and dental tools, working the ground the way archaeologists work an ancient burial site. They were not digging up an ancient burial site. They were digging up a school. By the time they finished, they had located and exhumed 55 sets of human remains from a patch of ground behind a reform school for boys, in graves that appeared on no official map, under no headstone with a name on it. Some of the remains showed gunshot wounds. Some showed the blunt, unmistakable signature of severe physical trauma. Several were buried in a scatter of unmarked plots, stretching well beyond the boundary of the cemetery that was supposed to contain them, as if whoever put them there had simply run out of room or stopped caring where the line was. The school these boys died at looked, from the road, like nothing much at all. Low white buildings under a canopy of live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Manicured lawns. A campus is the word people used. It opened in Marianna, Florida, on the 1st of January 1900, and for most of the 20th century it was, at various points, the largest juvenile reform institution in the United States. Boys were sent there for grand theft and for murder. They were also sent there for truancy, for running away from home, for being an orphan nobody else wanted, and, for decades, simply for being the wrong color and being seen on the wrong street. For 111 years it operated. Inside a low concrete building, the boys came to call the White House. Staff members strapped children until the leather tore skin and left scar tissue that some of them carried for the rest of their lives. Survivors would eventually organize themselves into a group with a name that told you everything about what had happened to them and where. They called themselves the White House Boys. The school closed in 2011. A Pulitzer Prize-winning novel and an Academy Award-nominated film made from it would later carry a fictionalized version of what happened here to millions of people who had never heard the school's real name. And in 2025, more than a decade after the last boy walked out the gate, the state of Florida finally started writing checks to the survivors who were still alive to receive them. This is the tragic story of the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys. Florida called it a school. The men who survived it called it something else entirely. If you find these stories worth telling, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps keep this channel alive. Now, let's step inside. To understand how a school for children became one of the darkest institutions this channel has ever covered, you have to go back before the beatings, before the graves, before even the name Dozier. You have to go back to 1897, to a state legislature in Tallahassee trying to solve a problem that, on paper, looked genuinely humane. The problem was that Florida, like most of the country in the closing years of the 19th century, had exactly one place to send a child who broke the law: prison, an adult prison, with adult men, for offenses that might be as small as stealing food or skipping school. There was no meaningful distinction in the eyes of the law between a 9-year-old caught stealing and a grown man convicted of armed robbery. Both went into the same system, and reformers across the country, from Illinois to New York, had begun to argue that this was a moral catastrophe and a practical failure. A child mixed into an adult penal population did not get reformed. He got an education in crime from men twice his age, and he came out worse than he went in. In 1897, the Florida legislature passed an act establishing what it called the Florida State Reform School, intended to separate juvenile offenders from adult convicts and give them, instead of a cell, an education. Vocational training, a trade, a second chance to become, in the language of the era, a productive citizen. 5 commissioners, appointed by the governor, were given control of the new institution. They selected a site in Marianna, a small town in the state's rural panhandle, hundreds of miles from Florida's population centers in the south, and they acquired a genuinely enormous tract of land, 1,400 acres, open, unfenced, more the size of a small township than a school. On the 1st of January, 1900, the doors opened. Understand what the campus looked like in its earliest years, because the physical design tells you exactly what Florida believed it was building. There was no perimeter fence, no wall. The site was laid out with dormitory cottages, a dining hall, classroom buildings, workshops for masonry and carpentry, and farmland the boys themselves would work. The philosophy, imported from reform movements happening simultaneously across the country, held that structure, labor, fresh air, and education could redirect a child's path more effectively than a locked cell ever could. Boys studied basic reading and arithmetic. They learned trades. They played football, basketball, and boxed on organized teams. Many of the buildings that eventually filled that 1,400-acre campus were constructed by the hands of the boys who lived there, brick by brick, the same pattern this channel has now traced at prison after prison after prison, except this time, the hands laying the brick belonged to children. From the very beginning, the campus was split in two. A dividing line, later marked by what is now called Penn Avenue, separated the south side, officially designated number 1 and reserved for white boys, from the north side, number 2, reserved for what the records of the era called colored students. 2 campuses, 2 sets of dormitories, 2 cemeteries. That segregation would remain in force, absolute and administratively enforced, for 66 years, and it shapes almost everything that follows in this story, including who got buried where and whose deaths got recorded at all. The optimism did not survive contact with reality for very long. For a brief window, in the earliest years, the school did function something like its founders had promised, at least on the south side, at least for the white boys assigned there. Superintendents who took the post in this period spoke, in their biennial reports to the legislature, of boys learning genuine trades, brickmaking, carpentry, printing, mechanical work, skills a young man with no other prospects could carry with him for the rest of his working life. The school's own print shop turned out a campus newspaper. Its brickyard supplied material not just for the school's own expanding campus, but, at times, for other state projects. Sports were taken seriously, organized, competitive, a source of genuine pride for boys, who had, in many cases, arrived with nothing resembling pride in anything about themselves. But on the north side, the story was different from the beginning, and it stayed different for 66 years. Decades later, when a group of elderly black men who had been confined at Dozier in the 1950s and 1960s finally returned to Mariana together, some for the first time since their release, to walk the grounds and put their own account on the record, the contrast they described was stark and specific. One of them, John Bonner, in his 60s by the time he spoke publicly about it, described the physical difference between the two campuses in a single plain sentence. On the white side, he said, it was more roomy, with industrial shops and woodworking facilities where a white boy could actually earn a trade certificate that might mean something once he left. The black side, he said, was the slave side. Richard Huntley, another of that group, had arrived at Dozier at 11 years old and spent 2 years there. While white boys on the south side were assigned vocational work that led toward a certificate and a trade, boys on the north side were disproportionately assigned to raw agricultural labor, field work, without the accompanying instruction or credential that made the south side's version of the same activity look, on paper, like education, rather than what it actually was, which was simply unpaid labor extracted from children. This was the two-tiered reality the state's own founding language never accounted for. A single reform school on a single 1,400-acre campus, operating 2 entirely different institutions under one name, separated by a line that is today marked, with a bitter kind of irony, simply as Penn Avenue. One side offering something resembling the rehabilitation the 1897 legislature had promised, the other offering something closer to what the historian and legal advocates who later studied the school's history would describe, in blunter language, as systematic racial exploitation of children, made vulnerable twice over, first by poverty and family circumstance, and then by the color of their skin. 3 years. That is how long it took for the first documented allegations of abuse to surface at a school that had opened promising the exact opposite. In 1901, and again more thoroughly in an inspection of 1903, state investigators found what the records describe plainly: boys held in leg irons. Children, some barely into their teens, chained the way the institution's founders had explicitly set out to avoid, in an arrangement that looked less like a school and considerably more like the prison system it had been created to replace. Investigators also documented a practice called peonage, in which the labor of the boys, ostensibly educational and vocational, shaded into something closer to forced, unpaid work, extracted under threat of punishment, on land and in structures that directly benefited the institution and, at times, individuals connected to it. The daily rhythm of the place, in these early decades, ran on a schedule that on paper looked disciplined and productive. Boys rose before dawn. They worked the fields, the sawmill, the brickyard, the print shop, the laundry, depending on their assignment. They attended a few hours of basic schooling. They ate in a communal dining hall, at long tables, under supervision. They marched, in formation, between buildings. Visitors, touring the grounds in this period, and there were visitors, because the school was, for a time, genuinely regarded as a point of state pride, would have seen exactly what the state wanted them to see: neat rows of boys, in matching clothes, tended gardens, a working farm, football practice on a Saturday afternoon. What the visitors did not see was the building constructed in 1929. It was a modest structure, 11 rooms, built of concrete block, containing 2 separate detention cells, one for white boys and one for black boys, intended to hold the most incorrigible or violent students under a stricter regime than the general population received. It was functional, it was unremarkable to look at, and within a generation it would earn a name that every survivor of this institution, no matter what decade they passed through it, would recognize instantly and never be able to forget. They called it the White House. If it looks, so far, like a story about growing pains at an ambitious institution, a school working out the difference between its founding ideals and the reality of running a facility for troubled children on the cheap in rural Florida, that impression will not survive what happened inside that 11-room building for the next 70 years. Picture a boy, 12 or 13 years old, sentenced to Dozier, not for a violent crime, but for something as small as truancy or running away from an abusive home, which happened constantly, because in the era before Florida had any meaningful child welfare infrastructure, this was often where an orphaned or unwanted child simply ended up, with no crime attached to his name at all. He arrives on a campus that, on the surface, looks almost pastoral. Oak trees, open lawns, a football field. He is assigned a cottage, a house father, a schedule. And then, for an infraction that might be talking back, might be wetting the bed, might be nothing he did at all, he is walked, at night, to the White House. Survivors who later organized themselves, decades on, into a group calling itself the White House Boys, described the building and the procedure with a consistency across their independent accounts that investigators found difficult to dismiss. A boy was taken inside, alone, without his parents present, without any outside witness. He was told to lie face down on a bed. A staff member, sometimes 2, administered blows with a leather strap, thick, industrial, the kind used in that era on farm equipment rather than on children. The strap struck the boy's backside and thighs in a rhythmic, counted beating, sometimes numbering into the dozens. Robert Straley, who was sent to Dozier as a teenager in the early 1960s, later gave a sworn account of what happened to him inside that building. He said he received 40 lashes from a staff member named Troy Tidwell, and that the beating left him with blood blisters and skin discolored deep black and purple across his entire backside. Straley worked afterward, as part of his assigned duties, in the school's small hospital, where he recalled treating other boys for the same injuries, soaking their wounds in Epsom salts and hydrogen peroxide, because there was, functionally, no other medical care being offered for what the institution itself had inflicted. He was strapped a second time not long after. He said he carried no visible scars from that second beating. He carried other things. Another survivor, William Haynes, described the sound before the pain, a staff member's shoe pivoting on the concrete floor as he wound up to deliver the blow, and then the strap itself. Haynes said he received 45 strikes from a staff member named Hatton in a single session, so severe that fragments of his own underwear were driven into the wounds on his skin. Jerry Cooper, the quarterback of the school's 1961 football team, and later the president of the survivors organization, said he endured 136 lashes with the strap on one occasion, and that he wrapped himself in 2 towels afterward, simply to stop the bleeding through his clothes. According to sworn testimony gathered decades later, the beating room itself had originally been a converted milking stall. Investigators who eventually documented the site found staff accounts describing walls and floors stained with blood. There were even accounts, never fully substantiated but consistent, across multiple former employees who came forward independently, of what was described as a beating club, a small informal group of staff members who reportedly met at a local coffee shop to discuss and, by some accounts, compare their methods. An industrial fan sat in the room, positioned, survivors and later investigators concluded, to muffle the sound of what was happening inside, from the boys and staff elsewhere on campus. If you're finding this one worth your time, a like goes a long way toward keeping these deep dives alive. Roger Dean Kaiser, one of the 2 men whose 2008 conversation with Robert Straley began the chain of events that eventually led to excavation and compensation, later wrote one of the most detailed surviving first-hand accounts of what daily life at Dozier actually felt like from the inside. Kaiser had been placed in the state's care as an unwanted child, shuffled through an orphanage before landing at Dozier, and his memoir describes a boy who arrived already starved for any adult attention at all, and who quickly learned that at this particular institution, adult attention was something to fear rather than seek. He described the specific dread of hearing his name called at the wrong time of day, the walk to the White House itself, the doorway, the sound of the strap being tested against the air before it ever touched him. He also described, and this detail recurs across multiple survivor accounts independently, a kind of psychological conditioning that outlasted the physical pain by decades. Grown men, 70 and 80 years old, who still could not hear a particular sound, a belt sliding through fabric, a certain pitch of a slamming door, without their body reacting as though they were 14 again, waiting outside that building. The physical discipline was only part of what happened inside the White House. Sworn statements and later investigative reports also documented what boys at the school called the sweat box, a form of solitary confinement applied disproportionately, according to survivor accounts, to black students on the segregated North Side. A boy could be locked into a small, poorly ventilated space, sometimes for days, in the heat of a Florida summer, with minimal food or water, as punishment for offenses that were never clearly defined and rarely, if ever, subjected to any kind of review. And there was sexual abuse. This is documented not just in survivor memoir, but in the sworn statement record compiled during formal state investigation. Robert Straley, the same man who described the leather strap, also stated under oath that he was raped while a student at the school. He was not alone in that account. Investigators in 2010 collected statements referencing a school social worker, since deceased, who multiple former employees alleged had molested students, and who, according to those same statements, was reported internally to the school's director and superintendent, and was, in the phrase used in the sworn record, told to drop the matter, with an assurance that the institution would handle it in due course. There is no record that it ever did. Corporal punishment of this kind was not, by the standards of the mid-20th century American South, universally hidden or even universally condemned. This was an era and a region where paddling in public schools was routine, where corporal punishment on children was widely accepted as ordinary discipline rather than abuse. And if you are wondering how a state-run institution allowed this to continue for 6 decades without meaningful intervention, so was almost every other reform school and orphanage in the country at the time. Florida's failure was not unique in kind. It was unique in scale, in duration, and, eventually, in body count. Because underneath the beatings and the sweat boxes and the abuse ran a darker current still. Boys who went into Dozier School for boys and simply never came out. The earliest catastrophic loss of life on record happened in 1914, when a fire broke out in one of the dormitories on the north side. 6 boys and 2 employees died in the blaze. They were buried, along with an unknown number of others who had died at the school in the years before, in a plot of ground behind the north side campus that would come to be known, informally, by staff and students alike, as Boot Hill. The name tells you what kind of cemetery it was. Boot Hill is the term the American West used for burial grounds reserved for outlaws and the anonymous poor, men who died with their boots on and nobody to claim them. At a state-run reform school for children, the staff had, at some point, unofficially adopted the same term for the plot, where they buried the boys in their care. There is a case from 1934 that stands out even against that backdrop, because of how young the boy was and how minor the reason he was there in the first place. A 13-year-old was committed to Dozier on a charge of trespassing. 38 days after he arrived, he was dead. The surviving records do not offer a clean, satisfying account of exactly what killed him. What they establish is the fact of it. A child sent to a state institution for walking somewhere he was not supposed to walk, and dead within 5.5 weeks of arriving. Between 1914 and 1973, according to research eventually compiled from state and institutional records, at least 96 boys died at the Mariana campus. Some of those deaths had documented causes: the 1914 fire, disease outbreaks that swept through crowded, poorly ventilated dormitories, drownings, and, in a number of cases that investigators found deeply troubling, violence. But dozens of these deaths were recorded with minimal detail, no clear cause, no consistent burial documentation, and in a segregated institution, where the North Side's records were kept with even less rigor than the South Side's, an unknown number of children who died there were never formally logged as having died there at all. This is where the myth-making that has surrounded this school for decades needs to be addressed directly, because the internet version of this story and the documented version of this story are not the same thing, and the documented version, if anything, is more disturbing for being harder to dismiss. For years, survivors and advocates for the White House boys circulated a figure that ran into the hundreds, sometimes cited as high as 200 boys buried on the grounds. That number became, in local reporting and in public argument over the site, a kind of shorthand for the scale of what had happened at Dozier, and it was aggressively challenged by defenders of the school and local historians who pointed out, correctly, that no forensic evidence supported a number that large. One local historian, pressing the point in a public meeting, asked pointedly whether 200 bodies had actually been found, and the answer, at that time, was no. The documented, forensically verified figure, established years later through the most rigorous scientific excavation, this channel has yet covered at any institution was 55. 55 is not 200. But 55 is also not the number the state of Florida had ever officially acknowledged existed. And the myth correction here cuts in an uncomfortable direction. The inflated legend of 200 bodies, repeated for years without forensic backing, actually gave the school's defenders a foothold to dismiss survivor testimony wholesale, when the real, scientifically confirmed number, 55 children in unmarked graves, some killed by gunshot wounds, some by blunt trauma, at a school for truancy and stolen bicycles, was already one of the most damning figures uncovered at any American institution in this series. The investigation that finally established that number began, as these things so often do, with a small group of aging men who refused to let the story die. In 2005, a group of former students who had passed through the White House in the 1950s and 1960s founded an organization they called the White House Boys Survivors Association. Roughly 300 men eventually joined. They elected as their president Jerry Cooper, the same man who had once quarterbacked the school's football team while enduring beatings of over 100 lashes at a time to stay eligible to play. For years, their claims were met with the same response survivor accounts of institutional abuse so often receive: skepticism, procedural delay, and a general public preference not to look too closely. That changed in 2008. Two members of the group, Robert Straley and Roger Dean Kaiser, connected over the striking similarity in their independent, decades-old accounts of what had happened to them inside the same building. They reached out to a filmmaker and civil rights activist, Michael O'McCarthy, who, it turned out, had his own history of abuse at the school. Together, their advocacy and the mounting weight of dozens of corroborating survivor statements finally forced a response. In 2009, the group persuaded Governor Charlie Crist and Attorney General Bill McCollum to authorize a formal investigation by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Investigators located and identified 24 unmarked graves during that inquiry, but the Fudley's findings, released in 2010, concluded there was insufficient evidence to support criminal prosecution of any former employee, some of whom were, by that point, elderly or already deceased. For the White House boys, it was recognition without accountability. The graves were real. Nobody would answer for them. The Fudley's investigators had done real, methodical work, even if the outcome frustrated the survivors who had pushed for it. Agents traveled the country, tracking down men now in their 60s and 70s who had scattered across the United States after leaving Dozier decades earlier, collecting sworn statements one at a time, cross-referencing accounts from men who had never met each other as adults and had no way to coordinate their stories, and finding, again and again, the same building, the same instrument, the same names of staff members, recurring independently across dozens of separate interviews. That kind of convergence, investigators noted at the time, is not something survivors of unrelated, fabricated claims tend to produce. Independent people, separated by 50 years and half a continent, kept describing the same milking stall turned torture room, the same leather strap, the same handful of men wielding it. What the investigation lacked was not credibility. It was a living, prosecutable defendant, physical forensic evidence tied to specific deaths, and a statute of limitations that had expired on nearly every act described. The state could confirm the graves existed. It could not, under Florida law, as it stood in 2010, put anyone in front of a jury for what had put them there. What the state investigation could not, or would not, fully resolve, science eventually did. In 2011, the University of South Florida, through forensic anthropologist Aaron Kimmerly, was granted a permit to conduct archaeological research on the Boot Hill site. Kimmerly, who would go on to become executive director of the Florida Institute for Forensic Anthropology, and applied science, assembled a team that would eventually include students, forensic scientists, and law enforcement personnel, drawn from more than 50 people across 9 different agencies at the height of the project. Florida Senator Bill Nelson wrote directly to the governor and to the United States Attorney General requesting federal support for the effort. Permission for a complete excavation was ultimately granted by the state's Attorney General and Cabinet. Using ground-penetrating radar to locate disturbances in the soil that the human eye could no longer detect, Kimmerly's team identified far more burial sites than the official record acknowledged. Over the course of the excavation, working from 2012 through 2016, and returning again in 2018 to investigate additional anomalies uncovered after storm damage to the property, the team located and exhumed 55 sets of human remains, 24 more than the 24 graves the earlier Fabloil investigation had found. Many of the burials lay entirely outside the boundary of what had ever been formally designated as the cemetery, scattered into the surrounding woods and brush, as though whoever buried them had simply stopped keeping track of where the cemetery was supposed to end. The forensic findings were, in places, unambiguous, in a way that no survivor testimony alone could have been. Some remains showed evidence of gunshot wounds. Others showed clear signs of blunt force trauma. These were not, primarily, deaths from disease or accident that had merely gone unrecorded through institutional carelessness. Some of these boys had been killed. Kimmerly's team then undertook the painstaking work of trying to give the 55 sets of remains their names back. Using DNA analysis, and by locating surviving family members, some of whom had spent 70 or 80 years wondering what had actually happened to a brother, a son, an uncle, who had been sent away to a reform school in the Florida Panhandle and simply never came home, researchers began matching remains to families. The first confirmed match was a boy named George Owen Smith. He had been sent to Dozier in 1940, at 14 years old. His family never saw him again, and for 7 decades they were given no real explanation for what had happened to him. Investigators matched his remains, recovered wrapped only in a burial shroud, against a DNA sample from his surviving sister, Ovell Krell, who had waited her entire adult life for an answer. Kimmerly, announcing the identification, said that the full circumstances of what happened to George might never be fully known, but that he would now be buried under his own name, beside the family that had spent 70 years longing for answers. He was one of the 55. 11 surviving families had come forward by the time identification efforts were fully underway, hoping for the same resolution. Not all of them received it. Some of the 55 have never been identified at all, and likely never will be. There is a second cemetery this story requires you to know about, precisely because of how absent it is from the record. Boot Hill, the site Kimmerly's team excavated, sat behind the North Side campus, the side reserved for black students. Under the segregation policy, enforced at Dozier until 1966, a white boy who died at the school should logically have been buried somewhere on the south side, in a separate, presumably better documented plot. No such cemetery has ever been definitively located. Robert Straley, speaking as a spokesman for the White House Boys years after the excavation, stated publicly that he believed additional remains from white students who died at the school were located somewhere the investigation had not yet reached. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in later years, including one prompted by construction crews clearing hurricane debris in 2019, identified dozens of additional soil anomalies across the property. Kimmerly's team returned to investigate them and, that time, found nothing more than tree roots and disturbed earth, no additional remains. The search for a second burial ground, the one that would hold the missing white boys' side of this segregated institution's dead, has never conclusively succeeded. It also has never been declared conclusively finished. Not every boy sent to Dozier had committed anything resembling a crime. Some were sent there for the crime of demanding equal treatment. In July of 1963, in the coastal town of St. Augustine, Florida, a group of teenagers, connected to the local Knock Youth Council, walked into a Woolworth's department store and sat down at the whites-only lunch counter to order hamburgers and Cokes. It was a sit-in, part of the wider wave of nonviolent civil rights protest sweeping the South that year, organized under the guidance of a local dentist and civil rights leader named Robert Haling. 16 young protesters and 7 juveniles were arrested that day. 4 of those juveniles, 2 girls and 2 boys, refused a deal offered by the presiding judge, their release, in exchange for their parents signing a pledge that the children would not participate in any further protest until they turned 21. Joanne Anderson, Audrey Nell Edwards, Willie Carl Singleton, and Samuel White refused. Their families refused alongside them. History remembers them as the St. Augustine Four. The judge sent them to reform school. 2 of the 4, the boys, Singleton and White, were sent specifically to Dozier. They were 14 and 16 years old. They were held there for roughly 5 months, through an autumn, a Thanksgiving, and a Christmas, spent apart from their families, before national pressure, organized in part by the baseball legend Jackie Robinson, and covered extensively in the black press, finally forced Florida's governor to arrange their release in January of 1964. 2 teenagers who committed no crime beyond ordering a hamburger at a segregated lunch counter spent nearly half a year inside the same walls, subject to the same discipline as boys who had been sent there for theft and violence. It is one of the clearest illustrations in the entire history of this institution of what Dozier actually was, underneath the language of reform and rehabilitation. A tool the state of Florida could point at any child it wanted, removed from public life, for almost any reason it chose, with almost no outside check on what happened to him once the gate closed behind him. For decades, that gate stayed effectively unaccountable to anyone. Local newspapers occasionally reported on conditions. Individual legislators occasionally raised concerns, and in 1968, Florida's governor at the time, Claude Kirk, made a personal visit to the campus. What he found, by his own account afterward, was overcrowding and conditions bad enough that he said, publicly, that somebody should have blown the whistle on this place a long time ago. That same year, 1968, the state officially banned corporal punishment at the school. On paper, the leather strap and the White House were finished. In practice, the building did not disappear. It sat, unused for its original purpose, converted into storage space, sealed off from the daily life of the school, but never demolished, never torn down, never fully accounted for. It waited there, largely forgotten by anyone outside the survivors who had been beaten inside it, for nearly 40 more years, until the White House boys forced the state to look at it again. We put hundreds of hours into each of these. If that's worth something to you, hit subscribe. The end, when it finally came, arrived not through a single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of pressure that had been building since 2005. Survivor testimony, media investigation, the FDLE inquiry of 2009 and 2010, and finally, in the school's last operating year, a full investigation opened by the United States Department of Justice into conditions at the facility. By that point, the physical footprint of Dozier had shrunk dramatically from its founding 1,400 open, unfenced acres. The Mariana campus, in its final incarnation, was a fenced, 159-acre high-risk residential facility holding roughly 100 boys between the ages of 13 and 21, most committed by a court for an average stay of 9 to 12 months, housed in cottages with individually assigned, unlocked rooms. Next door sat a separate maximum risk unit, the Jackson Juvenile Offender Center, which held its most serious offenders the way an adult prison would, in single, locked cells. It would be a mistake, and a myth in its own right, to assume that the cruelty at Dozier belonged only to the era of the leather strap, sealed away in 1968, along with the White House itself. The Department of Justice's own investigation opened formally on the 7th of April 2010 and conducted under federal civil rights law that empowers the department to act against institutions engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional treatment of confined youth, found serious, ongoing violations at Dozier in its final years of operation, decades after corporal punishment had officially ended. Investigators documented youth held in disciplinary isolation for periods stretching up to 120 consecutive days, a practice courts have repeatedly found to serve no rehabilitative purpose whatsoever, and to function, in practice, as pure punishment. They found a pattern of transferring boys to the maximum risk lockdown unit next door, the Jackson Juvenile Offender Center, as an additional disciplinary tool rather than a genuine security classification. They found what the final report called deliberate indifference to youth at risk of self-harm and suicide, failures to adequately protect confined children from injury, and a systemic absence of the oversight and accountability structures that should have caught any of this decades earlier. The department's final report, delivered to Governor Rick Scott in December of 2011, used language that could have been written about the school in 1903 rather than 2011. The state's failures, it concluded, amounted to systemic, egregious, and dangerous practices, worsened by a persistent lack of accountability and control. 108 years after the first documented allegations of boys held in leg irons, the federal government was still describing, in its own formal findings, essentially the same institutional failure, dressed in updated administrative language, but recognizable underneath it, as the identical problem: a closed institution, holding children the public had mostly stopped thinking about, with nobody with real power looking closely enough, or often enough, or soon enough. On the 30th of June, 2011, with the Department of Justice investigation still active and public pressure from the White House boys at its highest point in the organization's history, the state of Florida closed the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys for good, 111 years after it opened, as an idealistic answer to the problem of children in adult prisons. The institution that had been meant to save Florida's troubled boys from one broken system quietly became a broken system itself and shut its own gates. What happens to a 1,400-acre campus once the state that built it finally admits, without quite admitting it in so many words, what happened there? The White House itself had already been dealt with, in a fashion, 3 years before the school even closed. In 2008, as the White House boys' advocacy was gaining real traction, and the pressure on the state to acknowledge the building's history became impossible to ignore any longer, Florida officials held a public ceremony and formally sealed the structure. A plaque was installed. The doors were closed. It has remained empty, officially untouched ever since, a single-story concrete building sitting on an otherwise abandoned campus, kept sealed rather than demolished, as if the state could not decide whether it wanted the building destroyed or preserved as evidence. The rest of the 1,400 acres followed the pattern this channel has documented, at institution after institution: dormitory cottages, left to the Florida climate, roofs failing under decades of humidity and hurricane seasons, hallways where administrators once marched boys to class, now open to weather and to the wildlife reclaiming the grounds. Photographs taken by researchers and journalists in the years after closure show the specific, recognizable decay of institutional abandonment in the Deep South. Kudzu and pine seedlings pushing up through cracked concrete walkways, paint peeling in sheets off cinder block walls, the football field where boys like Jerry Cooper once played and were beaten to stay eligible to keep playing, gone to weeds. Formal acknowledgement, when it finally came from the state itself, arrived in stages. In 2017, the Florida legislature issued a formal apology to the survivors of the school. language that used the word atrocities, and stated plainly that what had happened at Dozier and at its sister campus in Okeechobee should never occur again. It was, by any measure, decades late for the men who had by then spent most of their adult lives carrying the physical and psychological weight of what they had survived as children. Jerry Cooper, the White House Boys' president, would not live to see what came next. He died in 2022, and by his widow's account, he was still, 6 decades later, dreaming about the bed and the strap and calling out the name of the man who had beaten him. On the 13th of January, 2023, the state dedicated a permanent memorial on the Mariana site, positioned deliberately next to the sealed White House building itself. It includes a courtyard with life-sized bronze sculptures, figures of adolescent boys arranged around a bed, on which rests a leather strap, the industrial fan that once muffled the sound of the beatings positioned nearby, and 2 boys depicted helping a third to walk away from the scene. A Department of Management deputy secretary, unveiling it before roughly 90 survivors and family members, said the memorial existed to give people a place to reflect and to educate the public on the school's history and to learn from it. The recurring object at the center of that memorial is the same object that has run through this entire story from the beginning, the leather strap. It appears in Robert Straley's sworn testimony, in William Haynes's account of the sound before the pain, in Jerry Cooper's 136 lashes, and now, cast in bronze, on a courtyard bed, as the single physical artifact the state of Florida chose to make permanent and public. The memorial gave the survivors recognition. It did not give most of them money, and for men now in their 70s and 80s, many with declining health and a limited number of years left to receive anything at all, recognition alone was not enough. That finally started to change, slowly, and only after another decade of lobbying, in the Florida legislature. In March of 2024, both chambers of the Florida legislature passed a bill, sponsored by Representatives Michelle Salzman and Kean Michael and Senator Darrell Rouson, formally titled the Dozier School for Boys and Okeechobee School Victim Compensation Program. It established, for the first time in the institution's 124-year history, dating back to 1900, a mechanism for the state of Florida to pay actual money to the men who had survived physical, mental, or sexual abuse at either campus between 1940 and 1975. Governor Ron DeSantis signed it into law that year as House Bill 21, appropriating $20 million from the state's General Revenue Fund to be administered by the Attorney General's office through its Bureau of Victim Compensation. The mechanics of the program tell you something important about how long institutional accountability actually takes to arrive, once it finally does. Applications opened later in 2024. Survivors, most of them now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, some in declining health, had to complete formal claim forms, submit documentation, and in some cases, provide sworn personal testimony recounting abuse that had happened to them as children more than half a century earlier. Attorneys who had worked pro bono with survivors for years, through firms including Levin Papantonio, helped many of the men navigate the process. By the time the application window closed, 930 claims had been submitted. 764 were approved. Compensation was calculated to divide the $20 million fund among the approved survivors, working out to slightly more than $21,000 per person. On the 30th of June 2025, 80 years to the month after some of the earliest documented abuse at the school, the state of Florida sent the checks. Bryant Middleton, a Vietnam veteran and great-grandfather, approaching his 80th birthday, was one of the men who received one. He had told a local news crew, in the years before the checks arrived, that the boys at Dozier had lived in fear 24 hours a day, and that he could still remember other children strapped to beds and beaten to a pulp. Richard Hill, another survivor, said publicly, that he did not think everyone was satisfied with the amount. $21,000, measured against a childhood permanently altered by what happened inside that concrete building. Carol Moore, a legal investigator who had spent years working the case, put it perhaps most plainly of all. What mattered most to the men, she said, was not really the money. It was that they finally got recognized, that they finally got some form of justice, however incomplete, however overdue. It is worth sitting with how long that took. A 13-year-old boy died at this school in 1934, 38 days after arriving on a trespassing charge. 96 years passed between that death and the first state-sanctioned excavation of the ground where children like him were buried. 125 years passed between the school's opening and the first checks being mailed to the men who survived it. Most of the boys who died inside those grounds between 1900 and 1973 will never receive anything at all, because there is no compensation program for the dead, and no fund large enough to answer for children whose names may never be recovered from 55 sets of bones in unmarked soil. If this story is hitting different from the version you've heard before, that's the point. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. There is one more piece of this story that needs to be told carefully, because it is the reason so many people who have never heard the name Mariana, Florida, or Arthur Dozier nevertheless recognize the shape of this history when they encounter it. In 2019, the American novelist Colson Whitehead published a book called The Nickel Boys. It told the story of two black teenagers, Elwood and Turner, sent to a fictional reform school called Nickel Academy in the Jim Crow-era Florida Panhandle, a school run with the same segregated campuses, the same brutal punishment building, the same buried, unaccounted-for dead that had defined the real Dozier School for 111 years. Whitehead had drawn directly on the documented history of Dozier, and specifically on the forensic work of Aaron Kimmerly, the anthropologist who had led the excavation of the 55 graves, whose own research and public account of the investigation directly inspired a character in the novel. The book won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2020. In 2024, the director Ramel Ross adapted the novel into a film titled simply Nickel Boys, shot almost entirely in an experimental first-person point of view that put the audience directly behind the eyes of the two boys living through the institution. The film starred Ethan Harisi and Brandon Wilson, with Anjanou Ellis-Taylor and Daveed Diggs in supporting roles, and it was released to widespread critical acclaim, eventually earning nominations for both Best Picture and Best Adapted Screenplay at the 97th Academy Awards. Millions of people watched that film, or read the novel it came from, and absorbed a version of what happened at Dozier without ever learning the school's real name, without ever hearing about Robert Straley or Jerry Cooper or the St. Augustine Four, without knowing that the archaeologist character in the story was drawn from a real forensic anthropologist who spent years pulling actual children's remains out of actual Florida soil, less than a mile from where the fictional version of the story was set. Fiction, in this case, reached an audience the historical record never could. But fiction is not obligated to name names, to cite sworn testimony, or to tell you that the compensation checks for the real survivors did not go out until the year after the film's biggest award season moment. That gap, between the story millions of people know from a screen and the story fewer of them know from the record, is exactly the gap this channel exists to close. There is a specific, quiet detail buried in Kimmerly's account of the identification process that stays with you longer than almost anything else in this story. When her team finally matched the remains of George Owen Smith to his sister, Oval Krell, in the years after the excavation began, Krell had waited 70 years for that phone call. She had been a child herself when her 14-year-old brother was sent away to a reform school for a minor offense and never came home again, and she had spent the rest of her adult life not knowing whether he had run away, died of illness, or something worse, with the state of Florida offering nothing beyond silence in place of an answer. She got her brother back, finally, as a set of bones wrapped only in a burial shroud, identified through DNA rather than through any record the institution itself had ever bothered to keep. That is what accountability looked like when it finally arrived, for one family out of the 55. Most families never got even that much. And here is where the story becomes, in its own way, stranger than either the novel or the film. In late 2018, the state of Florida formally transferred ownership of the entire Dozier property, all 1,400 acres of it, to Jackson County, the rural county that contains Marianna. County officials, who had watched the site sit fenced and idle for the better part of a decade, framed the transfer as an opportunity. Local leaders spoke, in interviews at the time, about their fear that if nothing was done, the abandoned campus would simply become an eyesore, or worse, a target for scrappers stripping copper wire and fixtures out of 70 empty buildings. Hurricane Michael tore through the region in 2018 as well, destroying much of what infrastructure remained on the property, including the old steam tunnels that had run beneath the campus for a century. What followed was years of grants, demolition, and slow, methodical redevelopment. The state awarded the county millions of dollars toward the effort. Plans emerged for a regional distribution and manufacturing center, for county government offices to move into some of the surviving structures, for a program serving young adults with autism to be housed in a former classroom building, for the old gymnasium to become a civic center, and the old cafeteria a museum. As of this year, the site has a new name. Jackson County has rebranded the property Endeavor Park, and in 2026, the county opened a new convention center on the grounds, hosting its first public events on the same land where children were once chained in leg irons, strapped in a converted milking stall, and buried without markers in the surrounding woods. County officials described the name deliberately, a way of stepping into a new future, a new endeavor, on ground that for a century meant something closer to the opposite of that word. The White House itself was excluded from the redevelopment. Under the terms of the state's land transfer, the building and the Boot Hill Cemetery were specifically carved out and preserved as a memorial site, the one piece of the 1,400 acres that the county is legally required to keep intact rather than repurpose. County officials have also discussed building a walking trail through the site so that visitors to what is otherwise becoming a convention center and a business park can still learn the history of the ground beneath their feet. That is the state of Dozier today. A convention center hosting corporate events, a short walk from a sealed concrete building where boys were beaten until the leather tore skin, and a still, only partially resolved cemetery where forensic scientists once knelt in the dirt with dental tools, looking for children the state of Florida spent a century trying not to count. Zoom out from Dozier, and the shape of the story is one this channel has now traced across prisons and asylums alike. But Dozier adds something the others do not. These were children, sent away not by juries of their peers weighing evidence of a crime, but by parents overwhelmed and unsupported, by judges applying vague statutes like incorrigibility, with no meaningful oversight, and, in the case of the St. Augustine Four, by a legal system willing to use a reform school as a tool of political punishment against children who had broken no law at all. An institution is built with a genuinely idealistic purpose: separate the children from the adult prisons, give them a trade, give them a chance. It fills past any reasonable capacity, because nobody ever builds a mechanism to say a court cannot send one more child through the gate. Discipline curdles into cruelty, because cruelty is cheap and oversight is expensive, and because a segregated campus in rural Florida, in the first 6 decades of the 20th century, operated with almost no outside accountability at all. Boys die, in numbers nobody outside the institution ever fully knew, and are buried without stones, without names, in ground that eventually gets called even by the staff who worked there, Boot Hill. And then, decades later, long after most of the men who could tell you what happened have themselves died waiting, the state finally excavates the ground, finally apologizes, finally writes a check, and finally renames the property, something that sounds like progress. The forgotten dead of Dozier are not an abstraction. They are 55 specific sets of remains, some showing gunshot wounds, some showing blunt trauma, pulled out of Florida sand by a forensic team working with picks and trowels, the way you would work an ancient burial ground, because that is functionally what this reform school's back 40 acres had become. 11 families came forward hoping for identification. Not all of them got it. Dozens more of the 96 documented deaths between 1914 and 1973 remain unresolved, uncounted among the 55, their names known only, if at all, to relatives who are themselves now old or gone. The leather strap that beat Robert Straley and William Haynes and Jerry Cooper sits, today, cast in bronze, on a memorial bed in a courtyard next to a sealed building, a few hundred yards from a convention center called Endeavor. Both of those things are true about the same 1,400 acres, in the same year, and Florida has not resolved what it means to hold both at once, any more than California has resolved what it means to run a rehabilitation center around the shell of an execution chamber. The state of Florida spent 111 years running this institution, and another 14 years after closing it, deciding what, if anything, it owed the men who survived. It has renamed the property twice now, once from Florida State Reform School to Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, in honor of one of its own superintendents, and once more, in this decade, to Endeavor Park, a name chosen to point forward rather than back. So when a novel wins a Pulitzer, and a film built from it earns an Oscar nomination, and millions of people absorb a fictionalized version of what happened at a place called Nickel Academy, and never learn the real name Mariana, or the real name Dozier, or the real names Robert Straley, Jerry Cooper, George Owen Smith, or the 54 other boys who came out of that ground in 2013 and 2014. What exactly are we choosing to remember? And what are we choosing, once again, to let stay forgotten? If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know exactly what this channel is about and what it stands for. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. We cover a different forgotten institution every week, and every single one of them has a story the rest of the internet forgot. We'll see you inside.